Let's back up to something that Warren said during this interview.
If you're motivated enough to do it, yeah. Like, I made a phone call to my mom, and I had to call her like 8 times before she picked up because either her service was bad because she was on the back side of the aisle on the south side, or my service was bad, and it was just hard to get through.
Do y'all see that? Oh no. Not only did Warren confirm that his mom was on the south side of the island, but Warren himself said that if you're motivated enough, you can call somebody. I tried calling my mom 8 times. Yet this is what he said last time.
A little off the island, you have cell coverage, and even on the island, like I called my mom when we were on the island, it was fine.
So which is it? Did you call your mom with ease, or did you try to call her 8 times because you were motivated to get in touch with her? And then Warren left after a phone call to Morgan. According to them, 10 to 15 people showed up and just walked into Jax's house and demanded the phone. Wyatt gave the address in which the boat was at. They all start migrating over there. Then they call 911 to tell them that the police are on the way to his house. Then they're searching the boat, and then they come back to Jax's house around 1 o'clock in the morning, according to him. Mind you, that's when they explain to the police about their friend being missing.
This case just changed. Somewhere in old footage, in an interview that already aired weeks ago, sitting untouched in plain view, there is a detail that changes the shape of everything. It was there the entire time. Nobody needed a leak, a new witness, or a break in the case to find it. All it took was someone willing to go back and listen a second time. Slower, closer, the way you listen when something doesn't sit right the first time through. There's the question of who actually reached the Coast Guard and when, because the timeline given to the public does not match what should have happened that night. There's a confrontation that broke out at a house, when a phone that should have stayed with Nolan turned up somewhere it never should have been. There's a distress call that, once you actually listen to it, does not sound like the way it was later described. And there's one phone call sitting in the middle of all of it that investigators believe changes everything about what actually happened that night. Before we go further, it's worth pausing on what this case actually is, underneath the timelines and the contradictions. This is a mother who has spent 6 weeks waking up every morning to the same unanswered question. This is a family that has had to learn the language of location apps and Coast Guard statements and revised timelines, not because they wanted to, but because nobody else was doing it for them. This case involves a missing teenager, statements to police that don't line up with each other, and questions that, 6 weeks later, still have not been answered. But if you're ready to follow this the way it actually unfolded, one contradiction at a time, stay with me. Subscribe if you want cases followed all the way through until the truth catches up to the story. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because what comes next will change how you see everything you thought you understood about this case. Somewhere on the 4th of July, in the middle of a holiday that was supposed to end in fireworks and porch lights, and everyone accounted for by nightfall, a mother's phone rang. Christine Wells picked it up, expecting reassurance. What she got instead was the first thread in a story that would keep unraveling for weeks. Warren Hudson told her something that night that sounded, on the surface, like reassurance. He told her he knew someone connected to the Coast Guard and that he planned to reach out to that contact directly. It's the kind of sentence that's designed to calm a parent down in the moment. It offers action without offering proof. It gives a mother something to hold on to in the dark without actually telling her anything has been done. Because knowing someone and calling an agency are not the same action, and the space between those two things is where a lot of this case lives. One is a name saved in a contacts list, a favor that might get answered quietly, off the record, between two people who trust each other. The other is a distress call placed to a federal agency, logged, time-stamped, and tied immediately to search and rescue protocol the moment the line connects. Those two things sound almost identical when someone says them out loud to a frightened parent at 11 o'clock at night. They are not identical in what they actually set in motion. This distinction matters because of what the Coast Guard itself said publicly in the earliest account of that night. Their initial statement was direct. No call had come in from the group until 12:30 in the morning, not 11 o'clock, not shortly after Nolan was first reported missing to family. 12:30. Sit with that gap for a moment because it isn't abstract. It's the difference between a mother believing help was already on the way and a mother who, unknowingly, was still hours away from an actual search beginning. Every minute inside that gap was a minute Christine Wells didn't have the full picture of what was or wasn't happening for her son. That statement stood on its own for a period of time before it was quietly revised. The agency later confirmed a call had in fact come through around that same window, 12:30 in the morning. Not earlier, not close to earlier, the same time as the original claim, only now confirmed rather than denied. Warren told Christine Wells he was reaching out to his contact closer to 11 o'clock. That is the account he gave her directly, repeated afterward. The Coast Guard's own records, both the original statement and the revised one, place the actual contact 90 minutes later than that. 90 minutes is not a rounding error. It is a specific, measurable gap between what one person says he did and what an official agency confirms actually happened. For a family already living inside the worst night of their lives, 90 minutes is not a small number. It's the difference between a search beginning while there was still time to matter and a search beginning after the window for certain kinds of help had already started closing. Somewhere inside that gap sits a question nobody connected to this case has fully answered. What took place during those 90 minutes? And why does the account Warren gave not match the timeline the Coast Guard eventually confirmed? That gap is the first place where this story stops holding together. While that gap sat unexplained, while a mother was still waiting on a call she believed had already been made, something else was happening across town. Nolan's phone was moving. Christine Wells had access to a location-sharing application the family used, the kind of small, ordinary safety net so many families rely on without ever imagining they'll need it the way she needed it that night. When she checked it, it told her something that didn't match what she was being told over the phone. Her son's device wasn't out on the water. It was on land. Try to imagine that moment for her, a mother staring at a small blue dot on a screen, a dot that was supposed to represent her son, sitting somewhere it had no business being if the story she'd just been told was true. Not moving toward help, not out on the water where he was supposed to be, on land, still, unmoving, while she was being told to wait, to trust, to let the adults handle it. She raised this directly with Warren during their conversation, asking him about the location the app was showing her. Only after she brought this to him directly did he tell her the phone was with the group he was with, though even then, he did not specify exactly where they were or why the phone had ended up with them instead of with Nolan. That single detail, the phone sitting on land while Nolan remained unaccounted for, set something in motion that would not stop for hours. It's the kind of detail that on any other night might have been a footnote. On this night, it became the thread a mother and everyone who loved her son started pulling on, because it was the only thread that hadn't already fallen apart. Family members and friends of Christine Wells began tracking the phone's location themselves, watching it move from place to place as the night went on. This wasn't passive observation. This wasn't people scrolling a map out of curiosity. People who cared about Nolan were actively following the last known trace of him, hoping against hope that it would lead somewhere with answers, refusing to sit still while a dot on a screen moved without him. That tracking eventually led them to a house where several of the young men who had been on the water that day were staying for the weekend. What followed there was not a calm exchange between concerned parties. It wasn't two families sitting down at a kitchen table to compare notes. According to accounts given afterward by more than one person present, somewhere between 10 and 15 people arrived at that house, upset, asking direct questions. Where was Nolan? Why was his phone there, with them, and not with him? Those who were present that night have described the exchange as tense and confrontational almost immediately, the kind of moment where fear and anger stop being separate things and start looking identical. One of the young men connected to this case, Warren, later stated publicly that he wasn't present at the house when this happened. He has said this clearly, more than once, placing himself elsewhere during that window of time, but the location data tracking the phone that night tells a different story. It places movement at that address during the exact hours he claims to have been absent. If he wasn't there, the open question becomes who was moving the phone and why it ended up at that location at all. During this same stretch of time, while a group of frightened, angry people were standing in a driveway demanding answers about a missing 18-year-old, a call was placed to emergency services. It's worth being precise about what that call was for, because precision is exactly what this case has been missing from the beginning. It wasn't made to report a missing teenager. Nolan had already been gone for hours at that point, and no one at that house had yet reported him missing to police. That call was made because the group tracking the phone was now leaving that first location and heading toward a second one, a family residence where parents were reportedly home alone, unaware of what was unfolding. The young men connected to that house wanted police present before that family arrived, to manage the situation before it reached their door. Sit with that for a moment. In a night defined by a missing 18-year-old, the first call to police wasn't about him. It was about protecting a house from the people who loved him. Protecting a house came before answering the one question everyone else that night was asking: where was Nolan? That order of priorities, securing property first and addressing a missing friend second, is the thread this next part follows. And once you see it clearly, it's hard to unsee. If this case has you questioning everything you thought you knew so far, this is the moment to hit subscribe, because what comes next is the detail this entire documentary was built around. According to the account given by one of the young men present that day, Jack, the trouble on the water began without warning. In the middle of what had otherwise been an ordinary afternoon, the kind of afternoon families spend every 4th of July without a second thought. He described a mechanical issue, a pump meant to keep water out of the boat that was failing to do its job. As the situation continued, the decision was made to call the Coast Guard, the agency responsible for exactly this kind of situation on open water. That call isn't something anyone has to take on faith. It exists as a recording, running just over 8 minutes from start to finish, available to anyone willing to sit with it, listen to it, and hear exactly what was and wasn't said. That matters, because Jack's later description of that same call, given afterward in an interview, does not match what the recording itself contains. In his retelling, he described the Coast Guard operator asking a series of questions he characterized as frustrating, to the point that the group made the decision to end the call rather than continue answering. That's the explanation he gave for why it ended when it did. Listening to the full 8 minutes tells a different story, and it's worth imagining what it actually sounds like. Not raised voices, not irritation, not a group of young men losing patience with a stranger asking too many questions during a crisis. There is no point in that recording where the operator's tone shifts, where the questions become excessive, where anything resembling frustration enters the exchange on either side. It stays steady and procedural from beginning to end, moving through location, head count, and the condition of the boat, the standard information any emergency responder is trained to gather, in the order they're trained to gather it. Nothing in that recording explains a decision to end the call out of frustration, because nothing in that recording contains the frustration being described. If the recorded call doesn't support the explanation given for it, then that explanation may have been describing a different conversation entirely, one that happened after this call had already ended, involving someone else, for reasons that have nothing. There's a second detail from that stretch of time on the water, and it stands on its own, separate from anything said afterward, separate from memory, separate from how anyone chose to tell the story later. Footage from that day shows a tow line being pulled back onto the boat during the exact window the group has said they were on the phone with the Coast Guard, describing a boat struggling on its own, out on the water, without help nearby. A tow line doesn't appear on its own. It doesn't materialize out of nowhere in a piece of footage. Its presence means one specific thing. At some point that day, this boat was connected to another vessel, close enough for a line to run between the two. Whatever else was happening on the water that afternoon, this group wasn't alone out there the way their account describes. That detail, the tow line, the second boat, was never mentioned during the recorded call to the Coast Guard. 8 minutes of conversation about a boat taking on water, and not once does anyone mention that another vessel was tied to theirs at the same time. Not once. That absence is worth sitting with, really sitting with, because it isn't a small thing. If a second boat was close enough to be tied to the one in trouble, that's ordinarily one of the first details you'd share with an emergency responder, because it changes the picture of who else was present and who might have already been helping. Leaving it out isn't a small omission. It's the kind of detail that either didn't register as important in the moment or was left out because it complicated a story that needed to stay simple. That question doesn't have an answer yet, not from any official source, not from anyone connected to the case. It sits alongside the 90-minute gap in the Coast Guard timeline as the second point in this case where the account given afterward doesn't match the evidence that exists independently of anyone's memory, anyone's retelling, anyone's version of events. Both of these threads, the call that ended for reasons the recording doesn't support, and the boat that was never mentioned even though it was tied to theirs, lead directly to the detail that changes how the rest of this case has to be understood. Warren Hudson was asked directly, on camera, about a call he made to his own mother that night, separate from anything involving the Coast Guard or the boat. At one point in that conversation, he described the call as simple, saying that even out on the island, his phone worked without issue, and reaching her that night hadn't been a problem. Later in that same interview, describing that same night, he gave a different account. He said he had to attempt the call to her 8 times before she finally answered, explaining the delay by pointing to weak signal either on her end of the island or his own. He then added something that stands apart from everything else said in that interview. He suggested that reaching someone, that night, came down to how motivated you were to do it. Those two accounts cannot both be accurately describing the same night. A phone that worked without issue is not the same phone that required 8 separate attempts and an explanation about weak signal. One version describes ease, a call that went through without friction. The other describes real difficulty, effort, persistence, with a reason attached for why it had been hard in the first place. This detail carries weight because of exactly what it undercuts. If reaching his own mother that night came down to persistence rather than signal strength, if by his own account, being motivated enough was what mattered, then weak service loses its standing as an explanation for anything else left unclear about that night. He is the one who said reach was possible, in his own words, describing his own experience, not a witness speculating, not an investigator theorizing, him. This is the specific detail the independent investigator following this case has pointed to as the turning point in everything she uncovered. Not because it proves on its own exactly what happened to Nolan Wells, but because of what it reopens. If reaching someone that night was a matter of effort rather than possibility, every explanation in this case that has leaned on failed signal or dead zones now has to be looked at again, held up against the standard Warren Hudson set with his own words. One phone call, 2 different descriptions of how it went, and a single idea raised by the person who made that call, suggesting that reaching someone that night was never really about whether a phone could connect at all. That is the call this documentary has been building toward. And it is far from where this case ends. Somewhere in the middle of that night, while a mother was still trying to piece together where her son actually was, sheriff's deputies say they spoke with several friends who had been on the water with Nolan earlier that day. According to that official account, those friends told deputies Nolan had last been seen with a woman who has never been identified or accounted for by anyone connected to this case. That detail raises a question that still hasn't been answered publicly. Warren, Morgan, and Jack have each said separately that they weren't on the same boat as Nolan that day. If that's accurate, none of them were in a position to witness who Nolan was last seen with, because none of them were there to see it. which means someone told deputies this detail, and that account made it into the official record without a named source attached to it. That is not a small gap. It's the difference between a detail confirmed by someone who was actually present and a detail that entered the record from a source that has never been identified, questioned, or asked to account for how they knew it. Until that source is named, this piece of the story remains exactly what it currently is. Unverified, there's also the matter of the broader timeline and whether it holds together the way it was first presented to the public. A call to the Coast Guard, initially reported as never received, later revised to say a call had come in closer to 12:30 in the morning. Set against that is Warren's own account, placing his outreach closer to 11 o'clock, nearly 90 minutes earlier. That gap has never been closed or explained by anyone connected to the case, not publicly, not on the record. And then there's the phone. It moved that night, tracked in real time by family and friends, actively searching for answers, people who didn't have the luxury of waiting for an official update, people who built their own picture of that night out of a moving dot on a screen because nobody else was giving them one. That tracking led to a house, and that house is where a confrontation took place, at a time when at least one person present, Warren, has said publicly he wasn't there. What that movement means and who was responsible for it remains entirely open. The data shows where the phone traveled. It doesn't on its own explain why. None of this proves definitively what happened to Nolan Wells. It doesn't identify who bears responsibility for the fact that he remains missing, and it doesn't answer the central question everyone following this case, from Christine Wells sitting in her home tonight to the strangers online who have never met this family but can't stop thinking about them, is still asking 6 weeks later. What it does is lay out plainly exactly where the official account and the available evidence don't currently agree. Those gaps belong to the public record now. They are documented inconsistencies, not theories, not speculation dressed up to look like fact, and they deserve a direct, specific answer from the people in a position to give one. Not a revised statement months later, not another quiet correction buried in a follow-up. An answer. 6 weeks in, that answer still hasn't come, and somewhere tonight, a mother is still waiting for it, the same way she was waiting the night this all began. This case isn't closed, and this documentary isn't the end of the questions surrounding it. As new information surfaces, as records are released or corrected, as more people refuse to let this timeline sit unexamined, this story will be followed all the way through, not left where it currently stands. If you want to be here when the next update on this case comes, subscribe now so you don't miss it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if there's a detail in this case you think deserves closer attention, say so below. There's more to this story than what has surfaced so far, and when the next piece of it comes to light, you'll hear it here first.